The humid air of June 168 BCE hung heavy over the dusty plains of northern Greece, baking under the unforgiving sun at the foot of Mount Olympus. Two armies, frozen in a tense, expectant silence, faced each other. On one side stood the disciplined Roman legions, the rising power that had begun to cast its long shadow across the known world. On the other, a force that had instilled fear for over a century and a half. 20,000 Macedonian warriors advanced in a dense phalanx. They didn't charge or shout. They marched with a measured, deliberate pace. This ominous quiet was the most terrifying sight a Roman soldier could witness in that moment. For before each man in that formation bristled 6-meter spears, sarissas, razor-sharp and pointed forward, harbingers of imminent doom. From a distance, the Macedonian phalanx resembled not an army, but a moving iron forest, slow, relentless, and seemingly invincible. For 150 years, this formation had conquered the known world. It was the same war machine that Alexander the Great had used to shatter the Persian Empire, to cross the Hindu Kush, and to carry the Macedonian banner to the very borders of India. Every general who had faced the phalanx on an open field had paid with the blood of his soldiers. Any tactic, any stratagem, any attempt to break through this wall of spears had proven futile. The phalanx was more than a combat system. It was a symbol, a living testament to the superiority of Macedon, the world of Alexander, over anything the rest of the world could muster. And on that day, this iron forest moved towards the Roman legions. This documentary will reveal the stark truth of what transpired over a few hours on that plain, how Roman soldiers found a vulnerability in the most celebrated military system of antiquity, how the very terrain of the battlefield turned against the phalanx, and how, in a single summer day, Rome not only achieved victory but also permanently buried an entire era of military history. The story of the Battle of Pydna is not just a tale of winners and losers. It's a narrative of two opposing concepts of war, discipline, and power clashing in a deadly embrace. It's the story of how inflexibility, even the inflexibility of perfection, becomes a death sentence. And above all, it's the story of the very moment when the ancient Mediterranean ceased to belong to the legacy of Alexander and passed into the dominion of Rome. If you're captivated by this kind of content, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Every week, we publish the most significant events of ancient history, told without embellishment or simplification. Leave your comments below. Do you believe the Macedonian phalanx was truly invincible, or did it already carry the seeds of its own destruction? Stay with us, because what happened after the initial clash on that plain proved far more unexpected than anyone could have imagined. In 168 BCE, the Mediterranean was in flux. Great powers that had dominated for centuries were giving way to a new, disciplined, and seemingly irresistible force emerging from the west. But to truly grasp the significance of the Battle of Pydna, one must first understand the world that existed before it, a world shaped by one man and his pursuit of absolute greatness. Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE at the age of 33. Leaving behind an empire that stretched from Greece to the Indus. He had no clear successor. When his generals asked who should inherit the throne, Alexander, according to ancient sources, replied with a single word: to the strongest. This response ignited decades of bloody wars among his successors, the Diadochi, who carved up his empire with sword and betrayal. The result of these wars was the division of Alexander's world into three great kingdoms: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Asia, and the Kingdom of Macedon in Greece and the northern Aegean. All three of these kingdoms were deeply Hellenistic in their culture. The wars between the Diadochi had drained the human and financial resources of all participants, and crucially, they lacked the ideological cohesion that had driven Alexander's soldiers to the edges of the known world. Rome, meanwhile, had been watching closely. Since the early 1st century BCE, the Roman Republic had begun to extend its influence eastward. Initially cautiously, then with increasing resolve, the Punic Wars against Carthage had forged the Roman legions in a way no Hellenistic army had experienced. The total war against Hannibal, with its catastrophic defeats at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and Cannae, had taught the Romans a lesson that no tactical manual could impart: how to endure catastrophe, reorganize, and still emerge victorious. This capacity for adaptation would become the hallmark of the Roman army, and would prove fatal to Macedon. The First Macedonian War, fought between 214 and 205 BCE, was characterized by low intensity, as Rome was forced to divide its attention across multiple fronts and could not fully commit to Macedon. However, the Second Macedonian War, which began in 200 BCE and concluded in 197 BCE, dramatically shifted the landscape. At the Battle of Cynocephalae in Thessaly, Consul Titus Quinctius Flamininus inflicted a crushing defeat upon Philip V of Macedon, the father of Perseus. For the first time, the Macedonian Phalanx had been broken by a Roman army in an open field. This sent an unambiguous message. The legend of Macedonian invincibility had faltered. Nevertheless, the kingdom of Macedon endured, and its new ruler was determined to prove that the defeat at Cynocephalae had been an anomaly, not a predestined fate. Perseus of Macedon ascended to the throne in 179 BCE upon the death of his father, Philip V. He was around 35 years old, possessed an imposing physique, a sharp intellect, and bore the weight of a dual inheritance, the glorious legacy of Alexander the Great and the recent, humiliating defeat at Cynocephalae. From the early years of his reign, Perseus set a clear goal: to return Macedon to the center of Mediterranean politics and to demonstrate to Rome that the kingdom of Macedon had no intention of accepting a subordinate position. He sought to bolster Macedonian influence in Greece and even within the Seleucid Empire in Asia. It was an ambitious plan, perhaps too ambitious for the realities of 2nd century BCE Macedon, but Perseus was convinced that the battlefield superiority of the Macedonian Phalanx could compensate for any political or diplomatic shortcomings. Militarily, Perseus made significant efforts to rebuild and strengthen the Macedonian army. He levied and trained a phalanx of around 21,000 infantrymen, armed with the traditional sarissas, spears ranging from 5 to 7 meters in length, with iron heads on both ends. He also reinforced the cavalry, traditionally a strong suit of the Macedonian army, and accumulated considerable financial reserves, which, according to ancient sources, amounted to approximately 6,000 silver talents, a colossal sum for the time. It was said that Perseus boasted these reserves were enough to fund a 10-year war. However, Perseus also possessed significant flaws, both as a commander and as a ruler. He was suspicious, parsimonious, and incapable of fully trusting his allies. When King Perseus II of Bithynia attempted to mediate peace negotiations with Rome, Perseus showed indecision. When Gallic mercenaries offered their services, Perseus chose to haggle over their price rather than pay them immediately, thereby losing a contingent of warriors who could have changed the course of events. When the Rhodians attempted diplomatic mediation, it was this tendency towards vacillation and excessive calculation at critical moments that would prove fatal on the battlefield of Pydna. The war between Rome and Perseus, which became known as the Third Macedonian War, began in 171 BCE. In the early years of the conflict, Perseus achieved some initial successes. He defeated Roman forces at the Battle of Callinicus in 171 BCE and successfully repelled Roman attempts to penetrate Macedon through the mountain passes. For a moment, it seemed that Macedonian resistance might endure. In this evolving situation, the Roman Senate dispatched Lucius Aemilius Paulus. This was the man Rome had long awaited to send to Macedon. He was not young. He was around 60 years old when he took command of operations against Perseus, but he was precisely the kind of commander Rome needed at that moment: experienced, methodical, incorruptible, and possessing a profound understanding of warfare that transcended mere tactics. He hailed from one of Rome's oldest and most prestigious families, the Aemilii. His father, Lucius Aemilius Paulus, had died in the disaster at Cannae in 216 BCE. This death had left a deep mark on the young Aemilius Paulus. The idea that duty to Rome was absolute, that a commander must share the fate of his men, and that defeat never excuses flight, became principles he would fully demonstrate at Pydna. Aemilius Paulus's military career was long and successful. He had fought in Spain, suppressed a revolt in Liguria, and established himself as a precise, rigorous commander, deeply respected by his soldiers. He was not the kind of general who sought personal glory through theatrical gestures. He was the type who meticulously studied the terrain, trained his troops with obsessive scrupulousness, and waited for the opportune moment before striking. This patience, this methodical approach to war, would prove to be a decisive quality at Pydna. When he arrived in Macedon in 168 BCE, Aemilius Paulus found the Roman army demoralized after years of fruitless campaigns. The troops were poorly disciplined. Previous commanders had allowed soldiers to plunder allied territories, and morale was low. His first step was a series of stern addresses to his officers, in which he unambiguously declared that things were about to change. He forbade looting, imposed iron discipline, and began to meticulously study the Macedonian army and the terrain where he was to fight. Aemilius Paulus was one of the rare individuals who combined practical experience in war with an almost philosophical capacity for analysis. He knew that on flat, firm ground, the Macedonian Phalanx represented a formidable force. He also knew, from the lessons of cynocephaly, that the Phalanx had a fundamental weakness. Its strength depended entirely on the cohesion of its formation. An intact Phalanx was almost invincible. A Phalanx that lost its cohesion, with gaps and breaches, transformed into a collection of scattered soldiers, each hampered by a 6-meter spear that was effectively useless in confined spaces. This understanding, honed by decades of military experience and careful study of his predecessor's mistakes, was the key that Aemilius Paulus brought with him to the battlefield of Pydna. He did not yet know exactly how the battle would unfold, but he was certain of what he was looking for, the moment the Macedonian Phalanx lost its perfection, and when that moment arrived, he would strike without hesitation. What happened in the days after his arrival in Macedon surpassed even his expectations, because the Phalanx, a 50-year-old war machine that had conquered the world, was about to meet its ultimate limit. And this limit was not the result of sudden tactical genius or a secret weapon. It stemmed from the very terrain on which it was to fight. To understand why the Macedonian Phalanx was considered invincible, we must go back almost 2 centuries before the Battle of Pydna, to the reign of Philip II of Macedon, Alexander the Great's father, a man who transformed a peripheral mountain kingdom into a military power capable of dominating the Greek world. Before Philip II, Macedon was considered a semi-barbaric region on the fringes of civilized Greek society. The Greek city-states of Athens, Sparta, and Thebes looked upon the Macedonians with a certain condescension, viewing them as rough hillmen, closer to the Thracians and Illyrians than to the sophisticated citizens of the Hellenic polis. When Philip II entered the throne in 359 BCE, he completely altered this situation, and he did so through a military revolution unprecedented in Greek history. The heart of this revolution was the Phalanx. Before Philip, Greek infantry fought in hoplite formations. Soldiers were armed with a round shield, the hoplon, a short spear of about 2.5 meters, and a sword as a secondary weapon. The strength of this formation stemmed from the cohesion of shields and the collective momentum of a mass of soldiers. It was an effective system, but it had obvious limitations. The spears were relatively short, meaning only the first rank could directly engage the enemy, and the formation was rigid and poorly suited for uneven terrain. Philip II changed everything by introducing the sarissa, an exceptionally long spear. Initially around 4.5 meters, it was later lengthened to 6 and even 7 meters in later versions. This extraordinary length had a revolutionary tactical consequence. In a sarissa-armed phalanx, not only the first rank could engage the enemy, but also the second, third, fourth, and even fifth. This meant that a unit 17 ranks deep presented the enemy not with 2 spear points per man in the front rank, but with such a high density of iron tips that the wall of spears became virtually impenetrable. However, to wield a 6-meter sarissa, soldiers could not carry the large hoplite shield. Therefore, Philip introduced a smaller shield, the pelta, secured to the left forearm, leaving both hands free to wield the very long shaft. But in a dense formation, this vulnerability was of little consequence. No enemy could get close enough to exploit it. Alexander the Great inherited this war machine and further refined it, integrating it into a more complex tactical system that combined the heavy infantry phalanx with the elite companion cavalry, the heteroi, as well as various light and specialized troops. The phalanx was the fixed center of battle, a granite block against which the enemy broke, while Alexander's cavalry would strike on the flanks and complete the encirclement. With this combination, Alexander defeated Darius III at Issus and Gaugamela, conquered Egypt, Persia, Bactria, and reached the Indus. The Macedonian phalanx became the very symbol of Hellenistic military superiority. But there was a fundamental problem with this system that Alexander always circumvented through his tactical genius and the exceptional qualities of his soldiers, but which his successors never truly solved. The phalanx performed ideally on flat and continuous terrain, where it maintained its formation and presented an impenetrable wall of spears to the enemy. However, on broken terrain, replete with natural obstacles, the phalanx inevitably broke, creating gaps. These gaps were fatal, because a soldier with a 6-meter sarissa could not fight effectively in close quarters or in conditions of disorganized melee. His weapon, which in formation was an absolute force, became a useless burden when the formation disintegrated. As early as 197 BCE at Cynocephali, this vulnerability had been demonstrated, but the Macedonian kings preferred not to learn from it, confident that merely finding suitable terrain would restore the phalanx's dominance. Perseus was certain that Pydna would be such a territory, but he was profoundly mistaken. While Macedon adhered to the same military tradition for nearly 2 centuries, Rome was developing something entirely different. It was not a system based on the perfection of a single impenetrable formation, but a system based on flexibility, adaptability, and the ability to respond effectively to any tactical threat. This fundamental philosophical difference was predetermined to be the decisive factor at the Battle of Pydna. The Roman army of the 2nd century BCE was organized around the Manipular Legion. This system had evolved gradually during the Samnite Wars of the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE and was perfected during the Punic Wars. The legion comprised approximately 4,200 infantrymen, divided into 3 distinct lines, each equipped and trained differently according to the soldier's experience. The first line consisted of the hastati, the youngest warriors, armed with the pilum, a heavy javelin, and the gladius, a short double-edged sword of Iberian origin. The second line was formed by the princeps, soldiers of intermediate experience, with similar equipment. The third line comprised the triarii, the oldest veterans, armed with the traditional hasta, a long spear, and considered an elite reserve used only in critical moments. However, the most revolutionary feature of the Roman legion was not its equipment, but its organizational structure. The legion was divided into manipules, units of around 120 men, capable of independent maneuver on the battlefield. Each maniple could advance, retreat, flank, or change direction without awaiting orders for the entire army. This meant that the Roman legion was capable of responding in real time to changing battlefield conditions, adapting its formation to obstacles on the terrain, enemy actions, and tactical opportunities that arose during the engagement. This flexibility had been severely tested during the Punic Wars. The Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE was one of the most devastating defeats in Roman history. Hannibal had surrounded and annihilated a Roman army of around 80,000 men with an envelopment maneuver that entered military history as an absolute masterpiece. But Rome did not capitulate. It raised new armies, changed tactics, learned to recognize its weaknesses, and corrected them. The ability to learn from defeat, to adapt, and to grow stronger was perhaps the most remarkable quality of the Roman army. Beyond structure, there was training. Roman legionaries underwent a regimen of physical and technical training that was unparalleled in the ancient world. Polybius, a Greek historian who lived in Rome in the 2nd century BCE and observed the Roman army closely, describes with admiration the precision with which legionaries were trained in the use of the pilum and the gladius. The pilum was designed to be thrown at short range immediately before hand-to-hand combat. Its iron shaft was deliberately made to bend upon impact, making it impossible for the enemy to extract it from a shield and throw it back. After throwing their pila, legionaries would close rapidly and engage the enemy with the gladius, a sword specifically designed for close-quarters combat in confined spaces. It was precisely this chaotic, physically brutal close-quarters combat that the Macedonian Phalanx could not withstand. Once legionaries closed to within the reach of the sarissas, the 6-meter spears became useless. And at Pydna, Rome was about to find a way to get there. The Battle of Pydna was not a sudden event. It was the culmination of a process that had lasted for nearly 40 years, during which Rome and Macedon had clashed in 3 successive wars, each more decisive than the last, and each bringing closer the moment of a final confrontation that would determine who would dominate the eastern Mediterranean. The First Macedonian War, fought between 214 and 215 BCE, was not a direct conflict. Rome was still engaged in a struggle for survival against Hannibal and could not afford to open a second front against Macedon. In 215 BCE, Philip allied himself with Carthage, hoping to exploit Rome's difficulties to expand Macedonian influence westward into Illyria, located on the Adriatic. Rome responded by supporting Macedon's opponents among the Greek city-states, particularly the Aetolian League, and by stationing a small fleet in the Adriatic to prevent Philip from crossing. The conflict concluded with the Peace of Phoenix in 205 BCE, without decisive battles or significant territorial changes. Rome, however, did not forget. The Second Macedonian War, fought between 200 and 197 BCE, was different. Rome had defeated Carthage at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE and could finally focus its resources eastward. The pretext for the war was a request for protection from Pergamum and Rhodes, two powers concerned by Philip V's expansionist policies. The Roman Senate decided to intervene and dispatched Consul Titus Quinctius Flamininus to Greece, a man who spoke Greek, admired Hellenistic culture, and understood Greek politics as few Romans of his time did. The campaign culminated in the Battle of Cynocephalae in 197 BCE, where the Romans met the Macedonian Phalanx on open ground and defeated it. This victory was not the result of a single stroke of tactical genius. It was the consequence of the flexibility of the Manipular Legion, which was able to exploit the hilly terrain of Cynocephaly to attack the Phalanx's flanks when its formation broke on the uneven landscape. Philip V was forced to accept a humiliating peace. He renounced his possessions in Greece, reduced his fleet to 18 ships, and paid 1,000 talents as war indemnity. Macedon remained a kingdom, but it ceased to be a dominant force in the Hellenistic world. Perseus had witnessed Cynocephalae with his own eyes. He had seen his father's humiliation and the defeat of the Phalanx when he ascended to the throne in 179 BCE. He immediately began to rebuild Macedonian military strength and forge alliances necessary to confront Rome. The Third Macedonian War began in 171 BCE when Rome declared war on Perseus, accusing him of violating treaties and threatening Roman allies in Greece. The first years of the war did not unfold as Rome had predicted. The Roman consuls sent against Perseus, Publius Licinius Crassus in 171 BCE, and Aulus Hostilius Mancinus in 170 BCE, proved to be mediocre commanders, incapable of breaking through Macedon's mountain defenses or forcing Perseus into a decisive engagement. Meanwhile, Perseus achieved several minor victories that fueled his optimism. But Rome was learning, accumulating experience, and waiting for the moment to send the right man. That man was Lucius Aemilius Paulus. The protracted confrontation was nearing its end. Aemilius Paulus brought with him not only experience and discipline but also a clear understanding of what was needed to definitively defeat Macedon. He knew that a partial victory would not suffice. Rome had already won at Cynocephaly, and Macedon had survived. This time, the victory had to be total, final, and without any possibility of recovery. In June 168 BCE, the two armies met on the plain of Pydna. What was about to happen would change the course of Mediterranean history for a century to come and usher in a new era. As often happens in great battles, the plain of Pydna is located, almost by chance, in the region of Pieria in modern-day central Greece, on a narrow coastal strip hemmed in between the Aegean Sea to the east and the slopes of Mount Olympus to the west. Today, this landscape seems peaceful, agricultural, dotted with wheat fields and olive groves. But in June 168 BCE, this plain was the point of origin of two opposing worldviews, two radically different military systems, and two imperial ambitions that could not coexist. The choice of terrain was not accidental. Perseus positioned his army with considerable strategic attention, using the region's geographical features. The plain of Pydna was relatively flat in its central part, which seemed to favor the Macedonian Phalanx, but it was not perfectly flat. It was crossed by small streams, dissected by uneven depressions, and interrupted by patches of loose and stony soil that could hinder the maintenance of a compact formation's cohesion. Perseus believed he could control these variables by carefully choosing the moment and direction of his attack. This proved to be a fatal miscalculation. Aemilius Paulus arrived at the plain of Pydna after a series of strategic maneuvers that forced Perseus to abandon the mountain defensive positions where he had been entrenched for months. The turning point came through a daring move. Aemilius Paulus sent a detachment of around 8,000 men, under the command of Tribune Publius Cornelius Scipio, on a wide flanking maneuver through the mountain passes. The objective was to cut off the Macedonian supply lines, and force Perseus down onto the open plains. The plan worked flawlessly. Perseus, sensing the threat to his rear, withdrew his army from its defensive positions and moved towards the Pydna plain, where he intended to engage the Romans in a decisive battle, confident in the superiority of the phalanx. For several days, the two armies stood face to face at close range without engaging in battle. Aemilius Paulus was a commander who disliked improvisation. He preferred to meticulously study the terrain, the disposition of the enemy forces, and choose the most opportune moment for attack. Perseus, in turn, waited for the Romans to make a mistake. This period of waiting and mutual observation was grueling for both sides. However, Aemilius Paulus used it to good effect. He personally inspected every section of the battlefield and meticulously planned the possible phases of the impending engagement. Ancient chroniclers, particularly Polybius and Plutarch, describe a remarkable episode from this waiting period. Aemilius Paulus, riding along the Roman lines and observing the Macedonian formations on the other side of a small river, the Lucus, which separated the two armies, was struck by the spectacle of the phalanx and its battle order. Plutarch reports that the Roman consul said that in his long military career, he had never seen anything more terrifying. This was not a confession of weakness. It was a testament to the profound impression the phalanx made on anyone who witnessed it, even a veteran of decades of military campaigns. But Aemilius Paulus immediately added that the terrain on which they were situated was not ideal for such a formation, and that they must wait for the opportune moment. As is often the case in history, the battle began in the most unexpected manner. According to ancient sources, the Battle of Pydna did not begin with a planned attack by either commander. It all started with a donkey. A Roman pack donkey, as Polybius recounts, broke free from its tether and ran towards the river Lucus. Roman soldiers, giving chase, found themselves in the river, and this movement was interpreted by the Macedonians as the start of an attack. Some Macedonian units advanced to repel what they perceived as an assault, and within minutes, a general engagement began without any commander having issued an official order to advance. It was a chaotic beginning that could have disrupted the plans of the most prepared general. However, Aemilius Paulus turned it to his advantage. As the Macedonian phalanx began to move, the effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. 20,000 warriors in dense formation, with their sarissas lowered in attack position, crossed the river Lucus and moved towards the Roman positions with that practiced, inexorable gait that had terrified enemies for 150 years. The noise was indescribable, the rhythmic tramp of tens of thousands of feet, the metallic clatter of armor, and above all, the distinctive, dull thud of clashing and vibrating sarissas, a sound that Roman veterans who had survived previous encounters with Macedonian formations described as deeply unsettling, penetrating the bones even before the eyes could register the danger. The first Roman ranks, the hastati, suddenly found themselves facing this moving wall of iron. The pila, which they threw in the initial stage of the engagement, weapons designed to breach gaps in enemy formations before hand-to-hand combat, proved almost useless against the density of the sarissas. The iron heads bounced off Macedonian spears or became lodged in timbers without piercing the formation, and the phalanx continued its advance. Plutarch recounts a striking testimony of that moment. Aemilius Paulus, observing the first clash of his troops with the phalanx, tore his cloak from his shoulder in despair. This was not a theatrical gesture. It was an instinctive reaction of a commander, seeing his men being repelled by a force that seemed irresistible. The Roman hastati were retreating under the pressure of the phalanx. Unable to break through the wall of spears, the ground before the first Roman lines was already strewn with fallen soldiers. The Macedonian phalanx moved as a dense and inexorable mass, just as it had done for a century and a half on dozens of battlefields. For a brief moment, it seemed that history was about to repeat itself, that the phalanx would once again demonstrate its absolute superiority, that the legend of Macedonian invincibility would be reaffirmed. Roman soldiers on the front lines experienced immense pressure. Some retreated, and the cohesion of the first Roman lines seemed on the verge of breaking. But Aemilius Paulus maintained his clarity of thought, while his junior officers insisted on immediately committing the princeps and triarii to the front to support the engaged hastati. The Roman consul took the most difficult step a commander could make in such a moment. He remained still. He carefully observed the movement of the phalanx, studied the terrain before it, and looked for something specific. He needed that exact moment when this perfect formation would reach its limits. And that moment was approaching, brought about by something that Perseus himself had not foreseen and could not control. The very geography of the Pydna plain imposed one fundamental rule on the Macedonian phalanx, the necessary condition for its functioning as intended. The terrain had to be perfectly flat, not almost, not conditionally flat, but impeccably smooth, without any natural obstacles capable of disrupting the integrity of the formation. This was a condition that Philip II had always observed, what Alexander had always sought to ensure, carefully choosing his battlefields, and what Perseus, he thought, had guaranteed by choosing the plain of Pydna. But the plain of Pydna turned out to be not as perfect as it seemed from above. As the phalanx advanced towards the Roman positions, forcing the hastati to retreat, the 20 meters separating the two armies revealed a series of irregularities that proved decisive. Small streams, shallow depressions, stony patches, barely perceptible elevations invisible to the foot soldier, but sufficient to disrupt the measured pace of a formation utterly dependent on its cohesion. As the phalanx advanced, some units accelerated slightly on favorable terrain, others slowed on more difficult stretches. Rangstiverged. Small gaps began to appear between the maniples of the phalanx. These were not dramatic ruptures visible from afar, but subtle fissures, almost imperceptible to the naked eye. But they were real, and Aemilius Paulus was scanning for them with the same intensity with which a surgeon seeks the precise line of an incision. It was at this very moment that a piece of information arrived that changed the course of events. Roman tribune Gaius Laelius approached the consul and reported his observations. The phalanx was diverging, not catastrophically, not in a way visible to the entire army, but it was disintegrating. The gaps between the Macedonian units were becoming wide enough to allow determined soldiers to penetrate them. Aemilius Paulus instantly grasped the significance of this information. He immediately issued an order. Roman maniples are to cease frontal resistance to the phalanx and instead actively seek the gaps, penetrate between the Macedonian units, and engage within the formation itself. This order demanded an extraordinary level of courage from the legionaries. It meant moving towards the most terrifying formation of the ancient world without attempting to keep it at bay, but it was the only way to destroy it. The consul immediately dispatched messengers along the entire line, ordering the tribunes to identify the breaks in the phalanx and advance their maniples through them without hesitation. And then he did something that Plutarch describes as a gesture of extraordinary tactical insight. He dismounted, removed his helmet so his men could recognize him, and walked towards the battle line. He wanted every legionary to know that their commander was with them. What happened in the following minutes became one of the fastest and most devastating turns of events in ancient military history. Roman maniples, obeying Aemilius Paulus's orders, ceased frontal resistance to the phalanx and began to seek out the gaps. They found them, and upon finding them, they threw themselves through them with a ferocity and determination the Macedonians were not prepared for. The mechanism of the phalanx's collapse was horrifyingly simple. A Roman maniple that penetrated the gap between two Macedonian units immediately found itself in a position of immense tactical advantage. The phalanx fighters on either side could not effectively deploy their sarissas to meet the flanking threat. The spears were too long, too cumbersome to maneuver in close quarters, and the Macedonian soldiers were trained to fight frontally, not from the side or from within their own formation. To turn a sarissa towards an enemy who had already penetrated the breach, a phalanx fighter had to raise the shaft, losing his attacking posture. And in the time it took to do this, a legionary with a gladius would already be close enough to strike. Roman legionaries used the gladius with deadly precision. Developed through years of specialized training, the Spanish gladius was a short sword with a blade around 55 centimeters, designed for thrusting in confined spaces rather than for slashing, like longer swords. It was the perfect weapon for this type of combat. It could be used effectively even when a soldier was so close to the enemy that he had no room to swing. Defending against the spear points of the sarissas, which the Macedonians desperately tried to bring back into a combat posture, and immediately striking at the belly or throat as soon as a breach appeared, the collapse was extremely rapid and devastating. Once the breaches were overcome, the effect spread along the entire line of the phalanx in a chain reaction. Macedonian units that found Roman legionaries on their flanks and in their rear began to lose the discipline that formed the basis of their combat effectiveness. Some soldiers tried to turn to meet the internal threat, opening new breaches, immediately exploited by other Roman maniples. Others tried to retreat, but the density of the formation made retreat practically impossible. Soldiers in the rear ranks were unaware of what was happening in front. They continued to press forward, while the front ranks, attempting to retreat, watched the phalanx disintegrate before their eyes in an incredibly short period. Ancient authors, particularly Polybius, describe his reaction as one of disbelief. He had created this army over years. For decades, he had believed in the invincibility of the phalanx, and now, he saw that confidence crumble in minutes. He issued no effective orders to rectify the situation. It was already too late for effective orders. The fate of the battle had been decided in the breaches of the phalanx. The Macedonian cavalry, which could have protected the phalanx's flanks while it was under pressure, did not do so effectively. Perseus himself commanded the cavalry, and his indecisiveness at that critical moment proved fatal. Instead of launching a decisive counterattack to buy time and allow the infantry to reorganize, Perseus retreated to Pydna with his cavalry, effectively abandoning the phalanx to its fate. The ensuing slaughter was of an extraordinary scale. The phalanx fighters who could not escape were cut down on the field, with almost no capacity to defend themselves effectively. The sarissas, useless in close combat, were broken or discarded. But without these spears, the phalanx fighters were mediocre soldiers, worse equipped and less trained for hand-to-hand combat than Roman legionaries. Plutarch reports that around 20,000 Macedonian soldiers were killed or captured on the field of Pydna. Roman losses, according to the same sources, were around 100 killed and perhaps a few hundred wounded. This casualty ratio is staggering to anyone who reads it. A 201 ratio in a general engagement between professional armies. These numbers, better than any tactical analysis, illustrate the absolute nature of the Macedonian defeat. The sun of June 22, 168 BCE, set over a plain strewn with Macedonian dead, and over a Roman army that, in a single day, had destroyed 150 years of Hellenistic military supremacy. The Macedonian Phalanx, the weapon that had conquered Persia in Asia, had fought its last battle, and Rome had become the undisputed absolute master of the Mediterranean. As the Roman legionaries completed the slaughter on the plain of Pydna, Perseus of Macedon galloped north with his cavalry. He had abandoned the battlefield before the engagement was concluded. He had abandoned his soldiers at the moment they needed him most, and he rode towards Pydna with the desperation of a man who had just seen everything he had worked for crumble. This was not a strategic retreat, it was a flight. News of the defeat spread with a speed that not even Perseus could have contained. Macedonian cities that had supported their king for years, hoping that the phalanx could indeed stop Rome, began one by one to open their gates to the Romans. Pydna, Beroea, Thessalonica cities surrendered without significant resistance. The Macedonian army, the war machine Perseus had built over years of investment and training, ceased to exist in a single day. Without an army, without the capacity for military resistance, the kingdom of Macedon collapsed with a rapidity that surprised even the Romans. Perseus first sought refuge in Pydna, then moved to Pella, the kingdom's capital, and finally, realizing that no place in Macedon could offer him protection, he sailed to the island of Samothrace. Samothrace was a sacred island, the site of an important sanctuary to the Kabiri, mysterious deities worshipped throughout the Greek world. Perseus hoped that the sanctity of the place would protect him, that respect for the sanctuary would compel the Romans to negotiate with him rather than capture him by force. It was an illusion. Like all of Perseus's final hopes, a Roman fleet appeared off Samothrace a few weeks after the Battle of Pydna. The negotiations with Perseus, initiated by Consul Aemilius Paulus, were not intended to offer Rome favorable terms, but to buy time and prevent his escape to other fugitives. Meanwhile, Perseus attempted to organize a sea escape, but all attempts failed one after another. Some of his most loyal companions betrayed him. When he realized there were no options left, Perseus surrendered to the Romans. The surrender marked the most humiliating moment in the life of a man who had aspired to restore the glory of Alexander the Great. Perseus was brought before Aemilius Paulus with his hands bound. Ancient chronicles describe this scene with details that vividly demonstrate the incredible contrast between the two men. Aemilius Paulus sat in the position of a commander, surrounded by his officers. Perseus, the last king of Macedon, lay prostrate before his conqueror. Plutarch notes that the sight of the king in such a state moved some of the Roman officers. Aemilius Paulus himself showed a certain dignity in his treatment of the captive, but he made no concessions on the main point. Perseus was a prisoner of Rome, not a defeated king with whom negotiations could be held. The triumph of Aemilius Paulus in Rome, celebrated in 167 BCE, was one of the grandest spectacles ever witnessed by the city. For 3 days, an endless procession of Macedonian spoils moved through the streets of Rome. Statues, works of art, weapons, armor, and most importantly, Perseus's personal treasury, those very 6,000 talents of silver that the king had accumulated, confident that he could fund a 10-year war against Rome. Then came the captives, the surviving Macedonian soldiers, court officials, and finally, Perseus himself in chains, forced to walk before Aemilius Paulus's triumphal chariot in full view of the Roman crowd. What do you feel watching the fall of a king who possessed all the power and lost it due to indecision and fear? Leave your answer in the comments. The defeat at Pydna meant not only the end of Perseus's reign, it marked the cessation of Macedon's existence as an independent political entity, the abolition of one of the oldest and most glorious state traditions in the ancient world. And Rome did this deliberately and systematically, with the same precision that had characterized Aemilius Paulus's military actions on the battlefield. The Roman Senate decided that Macedon should not simply become a vassal kingdom, as had happened after Cynoscephalae. The lesson of the Philip Wars was that preserving the Macedonian kingdom would mean allowing a future king to reassemble an army and challenge Rome. This time, the decision had to be final. In 167 BCE, the Senate issued a decree that abolished the kingdom of Macedon and divided its territory into 4 separate republics, each with its own government, its own laws, and its own borders. The 4 republics could trade with each other and with the rest of the Greek world, but they could not create a common army. This was a political decision of extraordinary subtlety. Rome did not formally annex Macedon, thus avoiding the administrative complexities of directly governing such a distant territory. The 4 Macedonian republics effectively became Roman protectorates, dependent on Rome's will for any significant foreign policy decisions. Perseus died in Rome a few years after the Battle of Pydna, likely around 166 BCE, never again seeing Macedon. Others suggest he allowed himself to starve, refusing to accept the fate of a captive. In any case, far from the kingdom he had hoped to restore to Alexander's greatness, Macedon remained divided into 4 republics for about 20 years. A man named Andriscus, who claimed to be an illegitimate son of Perseus, led a revolt that briefly restored Macedonian unity under an independent rule. Rome responded with force, suppressing the revolt in 148 BCE, and this time, it did not stop at dividing the territory. In 146 BCE, Macedon became a Roman province in all respects, the first Roman province in the Balkan Peninsula. From the founding of the kingdom by Perdiccas I to its Roman annexation, it all ended with an administrative decision of the Roman Senate. The land that had produced Philip II and Alexander the Great, the land from which the conquest of the known world had begun, became a peripheral province of the Roman Empire, a source of resources and labor. Like many others, the name Macedon survived as a geographical and administrative designation. But the kingdom, the dynasty, the military tradition that had dominated the ancient world for nearly 2 centuries, vanished forever. June 22, 168 BCE, was not just a day when Rome achieved victory over Macedon. On that day, the ancient Mediterranean irrevocably changed its masters, and the consequences of this event extended far beyond the plains of Pydna. It marked not only the end of the Macedonian kingdom but a complete restructuring of the entire political, cultural, and military order of the ancient world. The first immediate consequence was psychological, and it was colossal. Other Hellenistic kingdoms, the Ptolemaic in Egypt and the Seleucid in Asia, had watched the course of the Third Macedonian War with keen interest. Both had maintained a cautious neutrality. Pydna shattered these hopes in an instant. The message was unambiguous. No Hellenistic army, however powerful and however entrenched its military traditions, could withstand the Roman legions in open combat. The Ptolemies and the Seleucids understood this immediately, and their foreign policy changed accordingly. The most obvious manifestation of this change occurred a few weeks after Pydna, in an episode that ancient historians refer to as the Popilius Circle. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV was conducting a campaign in Egypt and seemed on the verge of conquering Alexandria when the Roman envoy Gaius Popilius Laenas arrived. Popilius delivered an ultimatum from the Roman Senate to Antiochus. demanding his immediate withdrawal from Egypt. Popilius drew a circle in the sand around the Seleucid king and stated that Rome demanded an answer before Antiochus left that circle. Knowing what had happened at Pydna, Antiochus retreated. This gesture, the Popilius circle, became a symbol of the new Mediterranean reality. Rome did not ask, it commanded, and the kings of the Hellenistic world obeyed. On a cultural level, the Roman conquest of the Greek world gave rise to one of the most striking paradoxes of ancient history. Militarily, Rome defeated Greece, but culturally, Greece conquered Rome. Horace, a Roman poet of the 1st century BCE, expressed this with the famous formula, Graecia capta ferum victorum cepit. Captive Greece captivated her savage conqueror. The Romans had always looked upon Greek culture with a mixture of admiration and suspicion. After Pydna, with the massive influx of educated Greek slaves, works of art, manuscripts, and philosophers, this culture permeated every aspect of Roman life. Greek became the second language of the Roman elite. Greek philosophy shaped Roman thought. Greek art transformed Roman aesthetics. Macedon had lost the war, but Greek civilization found in Rome its new vehicle for worldwide dissemination. The Battle of Pydna is not merely an episode in ancient history. It is one of the most analyzed studies in world military history. It is still studied in military academies as a prime example of how tactical inflexibility, even to the point of perfection within its context, becomes a fatal vulnerability in the face of an adaptable adversary. The principle that Aemilius Paulus employed at Pydna has remained relevant for centuries. Any combat system, however powerful, functions optimally only under certain conditions and becomes ineffective in others. The Macedonian Phalanx was invincible on flat terrain, in a dense formation, against an enemy attempting to break it frontally. And this vulnerability was not a secret. It was known. It had been demonstrated at Cynocephaly and was embedded in the very geometry of the formation. Perseus's tragedy was that he failed to learn from this known weakness. Rome, conversely, built its military system on a fundamentally different basis. Its maniples did not possess the destructive power of the phalanx in ideal conditions, but they functioned effectively in almost any. They could fight on uneven terrain, adapt their formations to circumstances, and respond to unforeseen threats without losing overall cohesion. It was a less spectacular system than the phalanx, but infinitely more reliable. This lesson, the superiority of flexibility over specialized perfection, has been confirmed in every era of military history. Medieval knightly cavalry, virtually invincible in direct confrontation with infantry, proved vulnerable to Welsh archers at Crecy in 1346. Napoleon's infantry formations, devastating in frontal assaults, were brittle against Spanish guerrillas in the Peninsular Wars. The Wehrmacht tanks in their advance through France in 1940 seemed invincible in maneuver warfare but were stopped by Russian mud in the winter of 1941. In each case, the structural basis of the narrative is the same as at Pydna. A force that achieved perfection within its operational context encounters different conditions and collapses with a speed that surprises even the victors. The story of the Battle of Pydna is ultimately a story about the arrogance of perfection. The Macedonian Phalanx was indeed the most powerful military formation of its time. It was not fiction, not propaganda. It was a system that had proven its effectiveness on dozens of battlefields for 150 years. However, this perfection fostered a deep blindness in its users, a conviction that it was enough to simply reproduce the system under suitable conditions to always win. They believed that tradition was self-sufficient and that there was no need to adapt to a changing world. The Roman army was not perfect. Its maniples were not absolutely invincible. They suffered devastating defeats and lost battles that seemed impossible to lose. There were moments when their very existence was in question. But Rome learned from every defeat. It changed tactics, reorganized structures, and assimilated the lessons of its mistakes with a systematic approach unmatched in the ancient world. And this capacity for learning, for adapting, for transforming defeats into constructive experience, ultimately proved more powerful than any military formation, however perfect. This lesson is applicable not only to military history, it concerns anyone who creates something that works, achieves a high level of mastery in a certain field, or is forced to defend a system that has already proven effective. The danger is not in weakness, but in perfection that ceases to question itself, in strength that ceases to adapt, in success that becomes a cage instead of a platform for development. Pydna reminds us that history rewards not the strongest in absolute terms, but the most adaptable. and this truth has never lost its relevance. If this documentary has piqued your interest, subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications so you don't miss new content. Every week we explore the most significant stories of ancient history, telling them with the same depth and attention to detail as in this video. And leave a comment. Do you believe there is a military or political force today making the same mistake as the Macedonian Phalanx, confident in its own invincibility in an ever-changing world? In the next video, you will find the story of another clash that changed the face of the ancient world. A story as brutal, as fateful, and as rich in lessons for the present day. Click and continue your exploration.